Hello everyone and welcome to the second of our Material History seminar series for 2024, Objects at Sea. I'm Margaret Anderson from the Old Treasury Building and I'm delighted that you've been able to join us this afternoon. Let me begin by acknowledging that I'm speaking to you from the unceded land of the Wurundjeri Woiwurrung people of the Kulin Nation. We thank them for their care of culture and of country and pay our respects to elders past, present, and emerging. But I'd also like to acknowledge any First Nations people who may be joining us from anywhere today. Material Histories is a seminar series offered jointly by the Old Treasury Building, Deakin University, and the Australian Catholic University. And I'd especially like to acknowledge the wonderful co-curator of this series, Dr. Lorinda Kramer of Deakin University. In each discussion, we explore an aspect of material history through an object or a series of objects. The seminars are open to anyone interested in material history, and we hope to cast the subject net widely in terms of both time and place. So if you're interested in contributing at some point, please do get in touch. We'll pop some web addresses on the screen at the end of the seminar. Now, we have two speakers today, each of whom will speak for about 15 minutes. This will be followed by a short discussion between the speakers and then questions from you, our audience. So it's my very great pleasure to introduce our first speaker this afternoon, Dr. Luke Keogh. Luke is a curator and an historian. His book, The Wardian Case, published by the University of Chicago Press in 2020, won the New South Wales Premier's General History Prize and was Garden Media Guild's Book of the Year. He lectures in the Museums and History program at Deakin University. And Luke's paper today is entitled The Wardian Case, Lost at Sea or a Case for Stories. So over to you, Luke.
Hello, everyone. Thank you for having me at this event today. To begin, I would like to acknowledge that I am coming from Geelong, which is on Wadawurrung country, and acknowledging all of the Wadawurrung traditional owners, past, present, and emerging, and acknowledging any First Nations peoples who are in the audience today. Thank you for having me at this online seminar series. I will try to be as brief as I can. It was quite a struggle to fit an entire book into 15 minutes, but I will attempt to do so and look forward to any questions that come up or any questions if you would like to continue the journey. Now, a Wardian case, some of you may have heard of them or not. I am a curator and a historian, and the first Wardian case that I ever saw was this one over here, which is the Wardian case from the Berlin Botanic Gardens, and it is on show here at an exhibition called Welcome to the Anthropocene that was held at the Deutsches Museum in Munich. And when I first saw this, one of the fascinating parts for me was that there is only around about 13 of these traveling style Wardian cases in collections all around the world. This is the only one, well, actually only one of a few that is held in continental Europe. And this is another one that is held at the Royal Botanic Gardens, Kew. So what is a Wardian case? A Wardian case is a box, as you can see here, with a sloping roof. It looks a little bit like a movable greenhouse. It comes up to about the hip of a standard size thaler, and it was used to move live plants. The glass inserts on the side here allowed sunlight in. The box was closed up, plants were placed inside, and these plants were put on the ship deck and traveling over the oceans to numerous places around the world. They were able to move many, many live plants, primarily in the 19th century and the early 20th century, but as I'll get into in a little while, had a significant impact on the global environment. Why this is important in a story about material histories, as I explained, is that it's a museum object as well. And part of looking at this as a museum object allows us to explore just one object or a series of objects, but then expand it into what are these global stories and possibilities. I'll get back into why these museum objects are quite important as we discover this lost object at sea. So this is what a Wardian case looks like. These are a few of the ones held in collections around the world. And why is it called a Wardian case? Well, it was invented in 1829 by this amateur naturalist, Nathanial Bagshaw Ward, who was a London doctor. His surgery was just behind the St. Catherine Docks, just up here at Wellclose Square. And what Ward discovered was that plants enclosed in airtight glass cases could survive for very long periods of time without water. Now, basically, Ward was trying to grow ferns out the back in his garden, and he couldn't get them to grow very well. This was, remembering, early 19th century, this is one of the most polluted areas with industrialization commencing on the London docks and all these sorts of things. And so one day, Ward plates, I usually have a bottle. This is my drink bottle, but it'll have to serve purposes. Inside a bottle, a glass bottle, wasn't a red bike riding bottle. Inside this glass bottle, Ward placed the chrysalis of a moth, waiting for the moth to hatch, but also in there had some soil, and in that soil hatched a fern, which was quite interesting. Ward undid the lid on the bottle, let the moth grow, but then let the fern continue to grow. And this fern grew over a number of weeks and months, and realizing that without any water, that fern was growing inside the bottle. And this fern he had tried to grow outside, but could not get to grow at all. From this short experiment, many other bottles and plants under glass and enclosed plants evolved throughout all of Ward's house. And then following that, he decided to test his invention. I should just say the backstory, 18th century, 17th century, is that many people were moving live plants around the world, but they weren't moving them in enclosed cases. And that was the really important part of Ward's invention, and Ward's showcasing that this could work. And so in 1833, Ward, with a few friends, George Lottages, who owned a famous nursery at Hackney, decided to test this idea of plants enclosed in airtight glass cases on the longest voyage that they could come up with, which was the voyage to Sydney. And so they packed a Wardian case full of plants, put it on a ship and sent it on its way. About 8 months later, having gone through various different climatic zones and various different pressures, it was opened in Sydney Botanic Gardens, and the plants were flourishing. That same case was then repacked by the curator at the Botanic Gardens in Sydney and was sent back to London. Again, the plants survived that journey. One of the plants, Glycine microphylla, this one that was figured here by in William Hooker's journal a few years after it arrived in London, was the first time it had ever been seen in England. Now, what it showed was that plants could be moved, live plants could be moved long distances on ship decks without the need for water. Now, it solved a couple of problems. One of the first problems it solved was that they didn't need care. And one of the biggest issues on board a ship was that you needed to care for the plants. Fresh water was very precious, and people didn't really want to use that fresh water to water plants, as well as the skill of having a gardener or another well-skilled person to look after plants was not always available. So it solved one problem there. The other problem that it solved is that some plants need to be moved as live plants. They can't be moved as seeds. And so by putting live plants into the case, you could move them all around the world. One good example is probably rubber. Rubber seeds have high oil content, go rancid really quickly. And so by moving them as live plants, you're able to transport them in many different locations. The image on the right here, this was the Wardian case was then quickly taken up by a whole range of botanical gardens, expeditions, nurseries, all range of people took up using Wardian cases to move plants around the world. These plants were packed into these sorts of cases, they were placed on ship decks, and they were sent to various locations around the world. This one here is the US ship Vincennes, which was part of the Wilkes expedition, the US exploring USXX, US Exploring Expedition, and the plants that arrived back in Wardian cases are the foundation plants for the US Botanic Gardens in Washington, DC. All right. One of the things about Nathanial Ward was that he was an amateur, so he was a doctor who was working full-time, and he was also a very keen naturalist, but he was also very connected. And so one of his very good friends was George Loddiges, who owned Loddiges and Sons, which was at Hackney Nursery. Ward was also very good friends with other well-known botanists, such as the Hookers at Kew, other scientists. Michael Faraday were in contact with Ward. Many scientists on the continent were in connection with Ward. And so the news of this invention was spread through these networks, and it can't be underestimated how important Ward's connections were in spreading news of the Wardian case. It had a whole range of important influences, and I don't have time to go into it here, but over the next 100 years, the Wardian case was used in a big way by the nursery trade. And it goes understated often how important the horticultural trade was in moving plants and in changing the plant biota in various regions around the globe. Other groups that used the Wardian case extensively were botanical expeditions, government-supported ones, or even private botanical expeditions. Also, colonial botany is a large one and significant in using this case to move plants around the world. I'll have a slide on that in just a moment. And what's also fascinating is after 1829, you start to see different countries start to take up using the Wardian case, and how news of this arrived is a fascinating story in the history of science. The French picked it up, the Dutch picked up using the Wardian case. A whole range of people started to use these Wardian cases to move plants. It's very much part of a colonial botany at that time. Now, as I mentioned, and I often forget to say this, but it was used to transport live plants. And so this is really important. Now, we know the Wardian case, we can imagine it in our mind today as something akin to the terrarium that we may have today. But these were traveling style Wardian cases, and I showed a picture of those a little bit earlier. We can't underestimate how important this was as resolving, let's say, a logistical bottleneck at the time. So before 1834, there was one estimate that said that only 1 in 1,000 live plants survived the journey from China to Britain. So after that, plants had a much greater success rate of being moved around the world. It was a global mover of species, remembering that there was soil inside this box. So you're not only moving just plants, you're moving a whole range of little critters and things that are held up in these cases. It was used by many different people, and it was used for roughly a century or a little bit longer. All right. One of the parts of the research in this book is, in my work, was also to uncover that there's a lot of silent voices, and a lot of people worked gardens and worked the horticultural trade and worked on plant collecting expeditions that go unrecognized. We have some, there were marina men in Madagascar on a French expedition. This one on the bottom right here is indentured Chinese laborers working in Samoa, and they're unpacking Wardian cases. Okay, so many different people were working in these trades and worked with Wardian cases, and it witnessed this whole range of change in the way we move plants and the way we grow plants and the economic botany aspects of those. All right. What's interesting about lost objects, let's call them lost museum objects, is they're quite hard to track down. One of the parts of the research that I did was to actually look at one source, and this was the Royal Botanic Gardens at Kew, and look at all of the incoming and outgoing plants of that organisation at a particular period of time. Okay, and so this image shows that just out of that one location, this is where Wardian cases were traveling all over the globe to all these various different locations. There were often a lot of ornamental plants sent out, and then in return, these plants were coming back, and we see that they're coming from a limited number of locations, but also coming from all over the globe. These ones coming back, these Wardian cases that are arriving back into at Kew, are largely coming from colonial botanic gardens, but the ones going out were going to many different locations. One of the really fascinating parts of looking into these records and to trace these Wardian cases was to show that when plants were being sent out, one of the big ones was ornamental plants, and in particular roses. Okay, and I was fascinated because roses are quite easy to send as seeds, but so we'd send plants out with all various range of pretty easy to move plants, but the plants coming back were often unknown foreign varieties of plants. And this helped people to create, scientists in colonial centers to create things like colonial botanies, extensive botanies of different locations, and it helped them to map the botanical geography of certain locations. So then you could see like plants growing in like locations, and then you could move those plants to those. So rubber would be a good example. If you move rubber from Brazil to locations in Southeast Asia where you have colonial control, you can then set up rubber plantations in places in which you can control. Okay, and so this has a significant economic botany aspect. Now, what we must remember is, yes, I'm talking a lot about plants, but they're all moving on ship decks. Now, one other part that I haven't actually shared before is that it is very hard to find pictures of Wardian cases on ship decks. I think the 3 that I have in this presentation are actually the very few that I could find in many years of research. But still, they did travel on ship deck. This is on the ship in the early 20th century. This is Graham Fairchild, who's very young at the time, who's the son of David Fairchild, well-known American botanist. All right, so I think you're getting the picture here, that many plants were moved in Wardian cases. We've got important economic varieties, coffee, tea, cacao. We've got lots of beautiful plants, fuchsia, chrysanthemum, magnolias, roses. We've got lots of trees moved. We have got a percha and other sorts of important other trees like rubber moved in them. Okay, so there's all these plants being moved across the oceans. And there's also many invasive plants and insects that were moved at the same time, and these cause many problems, and many of them we're still dealing with today. Okay, so we have insects common in the soil that was moved in these Wardian cases, but also plant pathogens such as coffee rust, Phytophthora, South American leaf blight. We have weeds moved. One of the more fascinating ones is flatworms, which is an invasive worm that, if it gets into certain locations, is very, very bad for the native flatworms that grow in locations. And so one of the aspects about the Wardian case that I found fascinating is that there's very few Wardian cases left in collections today. Okay, so there's, as I mentioned at the beginning, there is roughly 13. There's probably more. If you know of any, please email me afterwards. I'd love to hear from you. But what happened was, at the end of the life of the Wardian case, we started to bring in a lot of quarantine restrictions to solve many of the problems. By moving all these plants around the world, we created these problems. To solve those problems, we started to bring in things such as quarantine restrictions. One of the outcomes of that was that many Wardian cases would be used once. They would then be burnt or destroyed soon after that use. And so there's very few of them left around because of the quarantine restrictions that came in at certain times. One of the more fascinating, interesting journeys that the Wardian case took in the early 20th century is not just to move plants, but to move insects for things like biological control. And so here we see the black fly being moved to Orlando to help solve issues in the orange plantations in Florida, and they're being moved inside Wardian cases on a ship deck, which I think is quite funny. All right, so as I mentioned, Wardian case is a very rare object in museums today. This is the only one that we know of in Australia. It is at the Waruna Historical Society in Western Australia, and it was recently discovered a few years ago. And prior to that, prior to people working out that this Wardian case was an important object, very important for Australia, it was used as a dog kennel for much of its life. So anyway, no longer a dog kennel, behind protective glass at the Waruna Historical Society, but also one of the very few that is in Australia. So I'll just wrap up by looking at sort of objects and global change. We see that people are large movers of plants. We're one of the largest movers of plants on the planet. This came about because of historical connections in the 19th, 18th century. Things like the Wardian case were really important for this. We are reliant on many of these plants, but we also have moved many of them by some of the actions that we've made. I am going to leave it there because I know I am running very short on time. I've written a whole book about it, and also very much happy to continue the conversation with whoever is out there and interested in these things. My email address is there, and thank you very much for having me, and over to the next presenter.
Thank you, Luke. That was such a great paper. After working for so many years in museums, I'm so ashamed to say that I didn't know anything about Wardian cases. Now I feel I begin to know just a little bit, but I feel as if I should have known about them because I'm also interested in plants and their movement around. So what a fascinating story, and a continuing one, obviously, in terms of all the species that we're now growing in areas where they weren't before. So I look forward to continuing that conversation at the end of this session.
Thanks, Margaret.
Thank you. Now we'll move directly to our second speaker, Dr. Peter Hobbins. Peter leads the curatorial library and publications teams at the Australian National Maritime Museum in Sydney. As a curator and historian of science, technology, and medicine, he focuses on what we can learn about the past when things go wrong, including through snakebite, pandemics, aircraft crashes, and shipwrecks. So perhaps the moral is don't talk to Peter before you travel, or perhaps we should talk to Peter before we travel. But today he's going to present a paper which he's entitled Pickled and Preserved, a brandy bottle, a drunken sailor, and a shipwreck. Over to you, Peter.
Thanks so much, and thanks for the wonderful invitation to join the seminar today as well. I really appreciate it. I'm joining you from Dulwich Hill in Sydney, which is a meeting place for the Gadigal, Wongal and Bidjigal peoples. And I have to start by referencing the subtitle of my talk today, because when I was thinking about it last night, I realised that this led me way back to why I became interested in shipwrecks in the first place, which is, of course, the adventures of Tintin, and particularly the dive on the shipwreck of the Unicorn with Captain Haddock, and that involved a brandy bottle, a drunken sailor, and a shipwreck. So sometimes these things that we enjoy as children stay with us and govern our entire careers as well. I'm going to be talking about a different shipwreck today, though. One is vessel here that you can see called Queen of Nations, which sank in 1881 just north of Wollongong in New South Wales. What I particularly want to talk about is this bottle that came off the shipwreck and is now held in Wollongong. It's a bottle of brandy. It's a very standard late 19th century commodity item. It's survived along with a huge number of other objects from that shipwreck that are still on the wreck site today, but also have sometimes come ashore and beachcombers find them and hopefully don't souvenir them. That actually is against the law. They hopefully actually take them into the Illawarra Historical Society. But this brandy bottle isn't just the survivor of a shipwreck. It also is part of the story of the shipwreck and part of the possible cause for the vessel to be wrecked. And we can see that coming out in this testimony here. It's a little hard to read, but these are minutes of the inquiry into the shipwreck that are held in Sydney. And you can see, if I read it very slowly, the final three lines say, "The captain was drunk, the best part of the voyage." So as soon as this ship had wrecked, and I'll go through the events in a moment, as soon as the ship had wrecked, the story started to circulate in the press and then through regulatory organisations like the Marine Board of New South Wales, that the captain of the Queen of Nations had been drunk in command and that's why it had actually wrecked on the New South Wales coast. And one of the key reasons that that story gained such currency was that the Queen of Nations, amongst other things, was carrying 3,000 crates of brandy, spirits and ale. So one of the things that I've been thinking about with this brandy bottle as a survivor of the shipwreck is the very fact that I think the drink that was on board certainly played on the minds of the crew, but I think it also played on the public imagination of the vessel, both after the wreck and in the ways that we've retold that story over the ensuing 150 years. Now, the Queen of Nations was a beautiful looking clipper ship. It was built for the Aberdeen line of George Thompson. They all had these characteristic green hulls and flew that white star line at the that you can see on the flag. They flew the white star flag that you can see on the mainmast with the red and blue and the white star there as well. Now, the Aberdeen line, as it was universally known, was renowned for being managed by a group of fairly august Scottish Presbyterians. They were very upright gentlemen. They cared a great deal about the quality of their ships and the safety of their voyages. So actually very few of their vessels wrecked in a long career sailing, particularly to the Australasian colonies from the United Kingdom. But also the owners, in particular George Thompson himself, were also very clear that their captains should be sober, upright and respectable men. And that becomes a problem when you've got a shipwreck and can be blamed on a drunken captain. The other thing I wanted to point out here is that this is a clipper ship and it's a sailing ship as well. So if you see that huge amount of sail that's been put out here while Queen of Nations is sailing along at a fair clip there, firstly, it probably drives home the sailing 3 sheets to the wind. You know, the main sails on a sailing ship are called the sheets. So if you ever wondered where that saying for being drunk came from, 3 sheets to the wind, you can see a sense of it here. The other thing is that that amount of sail can convey a sailing ship at great speed, but it takes a lot of people to manage it. You've got to haul up and haul down those sails in fairly quick manner in order to respond to changing wind conditions. Therefore, you need quite a sizable crew. Now, during its early career as an immigrant ship, sailing people primarily from the United Kingdom to the Australasian colonies, especially Sydney, but also to Queensland and also to New Zealand, the crew on board the Queen of Nations would be about 45 sailors, usually about 5 officers and 45 ordinary sailors. But for the voyage that we're talking about here, which left London in early 1881, the crew was only 24, so 4 officers and 20 crew. They still had to manage all of that sail, but there were far fewer of them, and that's something to keep in mind. The other thing about sailing voyages of this time was that they were generally non-stop. So a vessel would leave Ireland or England and sail all the way down the coast of Africa, catch the roaring 40s across the South Indian Ocean and sail through Bass Strait and then up the east coast of Australia without calling to land anywhere. So that meant for very long journeys, often 3 or 4 months at a time. And if it was a quick journey, great. But if the journey dragged out, as this particular one did, into over 90 days, you can imagine that reduced crew getting quite tired. And the weight of that responsibility fell particularly on the captain or the master of the ship. And the captain of the Queen of Nations for that voyage in 1881 was Samuel Bach, B-A-C-H-E. I say that because it's a Germanic name that's often misrepresented in the historical record. But the timing's also important. 1881 was a period of transition on the oceans. So here's another Aberdeen Line vessel that was launched around this time, around about 1880, the SS Australasian. Now you can see something dramatically different here. It still has some masts and would have auxiliary sail, but now it's a steam-powered vessel. You can see the flag, the company flag on the top of the main mast still. But having steam-powered vessels dramatically changed not just the speed and reliability of ocean travel, but actually the very routes and the sorts of people who are on board as well. So a steamship like this, instead of sailing non-stop from England to Australia, would now go through the Mediterranean, through the Suez Canal, which had opened in 1869, skirt along the bottom of India, then down through the Dutch East Indies to the Australian colonies. In doing that, it would stop at many places. It needed to take on coal. But it also meant that the crew would have a lot more opportunities to rest and recuperate, and you could bring on fresh supplies as well. Because steamships were so much more reliable and they actually started to run to a regular schedule, that's why we started to use the phrase ocean liners, because they followed a standard line on the map. And you can see the portholes on the side of the hull of the Australasian here. These vessels rapidly became much more popular with passengers than the older sailing ships, because you could rely on getting somewhere pretty much when the company said you would, rather than being at the mercy of the winds. But there's a problem. That funnel that you see in the middle of the ship goes down to a very large marine steam engine that's surrounded by coal bunkers. And so a large amount of the hold of this ship was taken up with the propulsion method, the steam engine and its coal, which meant that sailing vessels, which were unencumbered below decks, were still really useful for carrying large volumes of freight as long as it wasn't needing to get there in a hurry. So, for instance, railway sleepers, which were on board the Queen of Nations, ceramics, and also the 3,000 cases of brandy, spirits, and ale. The other great advantage of steamships was that they could get you out of trouble in a hurry. So here's some research that one of the visitors of our museum has compiled recently, showing the number of sailing ships that were lost in Australian waters over 150 years, from 1800 to about 1950. Now, they follow a fairly standard bell-shaped curve, but have a look where the peak is, right in the middle there, 1875 to 1879. Now, this is partly a function of the number of vessels sailing to Australia, and it also starts to drop off after that period because you've got more steamships and fewer sailing ships. But nevertheless, you can see that there's, by the late 1870s, we're losing something like 90 sailing ships every year in Australian waters. Being Australians, what do? We want the government to do something about it. So that leads to a range of changes in sailing to Australia. One of those saw the establishment of the Marine Board of New South Wales in 1872. Remember, New South Wales was still a colony at this point, not a state. And one of the Marine Board's jobs was to manage the safety of ships at a time when there were a lot more laws improving the safety and quality of vessels and sailors' conditions in Britain. But here in the Australian colonies, we also started to take on seaworthiness, crew registration, and also the small issue of lighthouses. Now, lighthouses are important in this story because after 90-odd days at sea, the Queen of Nations on the 30th of May, 1881, knew that it was somewhere along the New South Wales coast. It was sailing towards Sydney, its final destination, but it was a cloudy night, it was a little bit stormy and wet, maybe not as rough as that very first slide I showed in my title, but it was certainly not ideal sailing conditions. And without access to the stars, the crew couldn't take their position, and the night was so dark they couldn't see where land was. However, thinking that they were just 6 to 12 hours out of Sydney, one of the crew at about 2 a.m., this is now on the morning of the 31st of May, 1881, one of the crew around 2 a.m. thought that he saw a bright white light off the port or left bow, or the front of the ship. So he gets the captain up on board. Now, poor Captain Buck has already had quite a difficult night. He's been at the end of a long voyage managing an undercrewed vessel, and he's been called up on deck regularly to consult in preparation for coming into Sydney. The crew point out this bright white light, which comes in and out of visibility. They think that maybe they're near Wollongong, and you can see the Wollongong lighthouse here, but there's a problem. The Wollongong lighthouse has a red beacon, not a white one. So the crew then think, wow, we must have a following current. In other words, the water behind is pushing them along faster than they thought. Maybe that white light is the Hornby light at the entrance to Sydney Harbour. So by now it's getting around to 5 a.m. On the morning of the 31st of May. And Captain Buck orders the helmsman to steer to port. In other words, to send the vessel towards shore. Now, this is a curious decision. It's dark, it's poor visibility. The crew don't really know where they are, but they do see a guiding light that they think is leading them to safety. ... This is where things start to go terribly wrong. So, just after 5 in the morning, the first mate on the vessel yells out, "Breakers ahead!" In other words, there's a beach right in front of them and they can see the waves breaking on it. Too late, Captain Buck orders the helm or the wheel turned hard around, and the vessel starts to turn but gets pounded by the waves and pushed towards the shore. And in the end, it actually gets driven backwards up a beach. And as you can see in this rather mournful photo, its back was broken and the main mast fell off, which you can see sort of missing in the middle of the scene there. Now, we can see this in a daylight photo, but this happened at night. It was still dark. The crew didn't really know where they were other than somewhere on Australia's east coast. And they were in a storm possibly that was going to break their vessel up. One of the sailors decided he would jump overboard and swim a line to shore, but sadly he drowned. But the remainder of the crew realised their vessel was staying intact, and they remained on board until daylight, when boats and lines from the shore got all of them off safely. But you can also see the condition of the wreck. I mean, it is reasonably high up on the beach. It was still full of its cargo worth 22,700 pounds, a huge amount in that time. And that comprised that huge amount of consumer goods that I mentioned that were being shipped out from England to the Australian colonies, including all those cases of ale and brandy. Not surprisingly, there was an inquiry. So the Marine Board calls an inquiry, which, corresponding with the day's newspaper reports, started to bring out a reasonably consistent pattern of evidence. Almost all of the ordinary sailors, the 20-odd men who'd been on the ship, started to testify that the captain had been drunk, either throughout the entire voyage or at least certainly in the final stages of it as they approached the New South Wales coast. Whereas Captain Buck and two of his three officers said that no, he wasn't drunk at all. He just made an error of judgment in sailing his ship backwards up the shore in the dark, not knowing where he was. Now, I'm showing you these records here because you can see on the left picture, the one that has the little sketch of the steamship on it, about halfway down it says Queen of Nations certificate suspended for 12 months. So Captain Buck, in other words, lost his ability to be a captain of a ship for 12 months on the adjudication of the Marine Board. And then if you look at the one on the right there, the handwriting at the bottom says R.A. Buck, master certificate, subject is under consideration, must and bring certificate to say has not been a confirmed drunkard. So in other words, Captain Buck had to go and get a doctor's certificate to say that he wasn't a habitual drunkard or an alcoholic, to prove that he was capable of possibly one day returning to command a vessel. So you can see again how that brandy bottle that was aboard, which possibly ended up in the captain's hand, I mean, not that particular one, but certainly brandy bottles like that, a huge amount of this cargo would have been treated as spillage on a long ocean voyage. You're going to always get some breakage on these sorts of voyages. Was the captain scuttling down into the hold to sample these wares or not? Well, certainly the Marine Board of New South Wales thought so. And you can see that just before this wreck in 1880, they published a survey of all of the wrecks and accusations that they'd investigated over the previous 8 years of their existence. And you can see, for instance, that whenever they'd encountered a case of confirmed drunkenness of a sailor, particularly a captain, they suspended their certificates for quite a long time. Now, if you're a captain of a ship and suddenly you can't be a captain of a ship, clearly that's going to have an economic impact on you, as well as a long-standing impact on your reputation, particularly if you're a captain on the Aberdeen line, which prides itself on having upright, God-fearing captains. The other part of the story, though, brings us to the shores of Taronji Point. Now, Taronji Point is just north of Wollongong, and this is where the Queen of Nations wrecked. As you can see, it sailed backwards up the beach in 1881. Now, of course, you're going to get a crowd of onlookers and journalists here to watch the spectacle of a shipwreck. But the other reason that they're all on the beach is to gather all of the cargo that started washing ashore as well, at least the more mobile items like bottles of brandy. So immediately you've got people sitting on the beach drinking champagne and brandy that's just washed ashore. And as far as they're concerned, that's fair game. In fact, the only reason that we know what was aboard the ship is the original bill of lading, the list of goods that were loaded on board it in London, has long been lost. But the salvage claims, in other words, the insurance claims to go and collect the items off the shipwreck before it broke into pieces, listed many of the items that were available, including quite a few bottles of brandy. So anyone on the shore was profiting, but ultimately other people paid for the privilege of going on board and rescuing what they could from the shipwreck before it disappeared below the waves. Now, speaking of which, this is what the site looks like roughly today. And you can see where that wave's breaking in the foreground there. The shipwreck's just somewhere a little bit above that. And it's actually quite shallow. It's only under about 5 meters of water. So it's an easily accessible shipwreck. And over the years, it's caused all sorts of hazards to swimmers and surfers. So the local council, amongst other things, has dynamited it at various points in time to break up the wreckage and make it less dangerous. But the story really becomes more important by the 1990s, when a storm in 1991 scoured the wreck. In other words, huge waves cleared away a lot of the overlying sand and revealed a large amount of the wreck. And again, just like the crowds in 1881, a huge number of locals in 1991 ploughed out to the wreck and grabbed whatever they could. And this didn't make the heritage regulators in New South Wales very happy, particularly under the Historic Shipwrecks Act 1976, which said that you shouldn't be doing this to a historic shipwreck. So that led to what was called a salvage survey, or a very brief diving program to try to document what was actually visible on the wreck of Queen of Nations. And before you ask, is that a gravestone to the sailor who died in the wrecking event? No, it's not. It's actually a blank headstone that was being shipped out to the Australian colonies from Britain, giving you an idea of some of the sorts of goods that standard freight vessels like this would carry. And in fact, if you have a look at the excavation, or the site diagram on the screen there, noting that the bow or the front of the ship is at the top, that's the bit facing the ocean, and the stern or the back of the ship at the bottom is the one facing the shore. You can see that there's a range of these other consumer goods that were being brought out to the colonies at this time, including barrels of cement, railway sleepers, copper coils, and possibly boiler tubes as well, in addition to cemetery materials, which you would think we probably don't need here in Australia. Similarly, there was a whole range of other objects on board the ship that are still there, and in fact, it's considered today one of the most intact colonial cargoes on any shipwreck in Australian waters. So, in an emergency move, the shipwreck was gazetted as historic, and any further removal of objects from it was considered not acceptable, illegal actually, after 1991. And the conservation management plan that now manages that wreck specifies that any further materials that come off the wreck, or anything that was removed before those protections were in place, should now be put into the care of the Illawarra Historical Society in Wollongong. And these are some of the objects that they had there. I've had the chance to go and visit them in Wollongong and held some of these objects, including the brandy bottle myself. They keep good care of them. Many of these objects were actually cared for by my museum, the Australian National Maritime Museum. They came to us for conservation treatment when they were recovered, but then they went back to the local community. And that's a really important heritage management principle, that objects coming off shipwrecks should really remain as close as possible to the site of the wreck, and because they're relevant to the history of that community and its connection with the ocean. So here's some of the goods that were also on board that ship. And I think it's interesting in terms of what Luke was saying earlier as well about moving things around the world. We've got things like bottles of pickles. Now, they don't look particularly appealing in these photos, but some of those jars of pickles, I would almost be tempted to open them and eat the pickles myself today. Similarly, like Captain Haddock, I can imagine popping the cork off that bottle of brandy, and it's probably still palatable, which gives you a sense of the incredible preservation technologies in place even in the 1880s. There's also quite a lot of other consumer goods, like a purple sort of with a violet medicine bottle, and that strange metallic shoe sculpture in the bottom there as well as things like egg cups. These were all the consumer goods that were being made in England and shipped out to the Australian colonies in return for our consumer produce. So bringing it all home, a bottle like this certainly speaks to why we preserve shipwrecks. It speaks to the trade in the colonial period and that transformation of technologies in the seaways from sail to steam, but why sail wasn't immediately redundant. But I think also this bottle of brandy reminds me that certainly the goods that were on board that ship shaped the narrative of how it was interpreted in 1881. And it continues to play on the minds of those of us who tell the stories of the Queen of Nations even today. Cheers.
Peter, thank you so much. What a terrific story, but also a very sobering reminder of the dangers of life at sea at that time. Those statistics are extraordinary, aren't they? I mean, I knew there were a lot of shipwrecks, but I really did not realise that there were that many. So that's a huge loss. The insurance industry must have been very unhappy at the time.
They were very unhappy, yes. I mean, they would get some of their money back from salvage, as I mentioned, if you could get to the wreck. But certainly the insurers were one of the main motivators behind having vessels that were properly built, properly surveyed, and regularly checked over as well. And Queen of Nations, a lot of the records from Lloyd's of London, the Lloyd's survey a lot of those records still survive and have been digitized. So you can assess, we know a lot about the material construction and dimensions of the vessel from those survey records.
Yeah, extraordinary. Now I'm going to ask Luke to join us now for our discussion. And let me remind you that we welcome questions from the audience for either or both papers. There they are up there, just to remind you. But while the audience is thinking, Luke and Pedro, I'm going to ask each of you if there is a question that occurred to you while you were listening to the other paper, or that occurs to you across the content of both papers that you would like to ask each other, just to get the discussion going here.
I'll go first if I can.
Certainly.
One wonderful paper. Thank you, Peter. It was great to hear and very exciting. I have many questions, and I've got numbers written next to them, but actually I'll try and find actually the one question I really do want to know is this wonderful connection between the Illawarra Historical Society and your museum, the Australian Maritime Museum. And what I quite like is the connection between a regional museum and a local museum. We saw at the end of my paper, one of the only Wardian cases held in a Waroona Historical Society. So the importance of historical societies, regional collections, smaller collections, let's say, to shipwrecks and some of the work that's done in maritime objects at sea.
Yeah, look, we're big believers in having a distributed national collection. So our museum is certainly empowered under our Act as a Commonwealth. So we're an Australian government museum. We're empowered to receive objects received from shipwrecks, but we don't want all of them, and so we do have a reasonably sizable collection, particularly from some famous shipwrecks like the Dunbar and the Zeewijk, so some different places around Australia. But broadly, the principle is that we like to leave those artifacts and the interpretation of them in their local community. So we go out and regularly visit them. The maritime archaeologists in my team have been travelling to South Australia recently, where they've found one shipwreck recently called the South Australian, and they're looking for the wreck of another vessel called the Koning Willem de Tweede, or King William II, as well. And they one of the first things they do is they go to the local dive shop and ask, what do you know about the wreck? And then they go to the pub, you have to, and talk to people there. And then they also will go to the local historical society and ask what objects have come in. And they have to make it really clear that we're not the Australian Federal Police. We're the Australian National Maritime Museum, and we're there to better understand the materiality of that wreck and its impact and enduring connections with the local community. In other words, we're not here to take your stuff away. We want it to stay with your community. The other thing I'll say about that is that we also administer MAPS, which is the Maritime Museums of Australia Project Support Scheme, which allows for smaller maritime museums right around Australia to write to it or contact us and say, we'd like your help. Sometimes they'd like one of us to go out and help them with interpreting their galleries or assessing their objects. But they may also say, look, what we really want, and this is what happened with Wollongong, is we'd really like your conservation advice and assistance with these objects so that we can care for them better. And so one of the things that we've just delivered in South Australia is a handbook on conserving shipwreck artifacts for use by the local community. And that's turned out to be really, really popular as well. So yeah, we do definitely believe these things should stay with communities. And we like to actually get out there on the ground and talk to them rather than expecting them to come to us.
That's great. Peter, did you have a question that you wanted to ask Luke? We
I
do
did
have
indeed.
a couple of questions in the Q&A too. So
I don't want to get in the way of the audience either, but look, obviously there's a long history of containers for moving objects around on the oceans. Going back to the amphorae of ancient Greece, which were reasonably standardized containers. You've got tea chests in the 19th century, and then you move to containerization in the 20th century. You spoke mostly about the Wardian case being used primarily for scientific exchanges, but did it also result really in a commoditization of large-scale movement of plants and also, as you said, some of those other pathogens, but also some of the other insects that were there? Like, are these proto-containers in a sense?
Yeah, look, a great question, Peter. Originally, when I set out, yes, I would say emphatically, when I put it on show, the intention was to put a Wardian case on show and then a shipping container. Now, we couldn't get the shipping container in the exhibition, so we put a model of a shipping container. But to show how containerization has containerization is an important part of global change, but has a long history back into earlier containers. So in some ways, yes. And one of the really important parts is to understand and I did make this point, but the nursery trade and how moving lots of plants for many different people, not just governments and these sorts of things, was really, really important. And also that the Wardian case was one way to move live plants, but there were many that preceded it in the 2 centuries or 3 centuries or even many years before that. So there's many people moving plants, and this was just this was one way that became very popular, especially in the colonial period. But I think there is a connection between us moving things over the oceans in boxes, containers, these sorts of things, and they just sort of get bigger, a bit like our consumption practices. But yeah.
Now, we do have some questions in the Q&A, one for each of you, actually. So, Luke, seeing you've been speaking, why don't we begin with you? There's one question here which asks whether the cases were best suited for transporting plants from Britain only, or did they fare well enough for plants from far-off colonies with very different ecosystems, like gum trees from Australia, for example?
Wonderful question, I think, and I probably should have captured that in the presentation. I did try and squeeze too many things into such a short period of time, but it was used all over the world to move a variety of species from different locations. And yes, the story I told was very British-centric, but in some of my other work, I've got into how they'll move from both colonies to European centres or from those centres. So the Germans and the French and the Dutch were also very important, and the Americans as well. And so it was a wide variety of plants. And so some plants will survive better in those hot, humid environments, tropical plants in particular, but they can all survive in those things. Gum trees probably differently. Most of them probably cropped up in the soil accidentally and got moved along the way, and then and also moved as seeds as well, because they're pretty robust most of the time. So
yes, fascinating. The question that occurred to me was whether Ward ever took out a patent. And so is he one of those gentleman scientists who believed in the free transport of knowledge? And
look, it was. There's two parts of the story. Is that Ward never took out a patent for the invention, but one of the important parts of Ward was that he promoted his invention, and it was among a time in the history of science. There's these moments in which there's a culture of development or a moment of development, and so it was among a time in which many of these inventions were happening. He never took out a patent for it, and there was someone before, a Scottish man, Alan McConaughey, who'd also discovered something similar and written about it in a far-flung publication, but also very rarely credited. But look, Ward's name's preserved on the case, and he survives today, so maybe he didn't need the patent.
Absolutely. Now, Lorinda's asked a question of Peter here. Really enjoyed how you built up knowledge of your object from a range of sources. Could you talk us through those that you had access to that deepened the picture of the brandy bottle and the stories around it?
Sure, yes. Historians always love talking about their sources. Look, I've got to give a lot of credit to Tim Smith and David Nutley, who were the maritime archaeologists who first dived on the wreck of Queen of Nations in 1991 when it was scoured out. They actually did an amazing job, really, before the internet era, of going through historic newspapers and reading some of the accounts from that period, as well as getting hold of some of the shipping records that were available internationally and in books at that time. So I've certainly drawn upon the work of Tim and David, and I spoke to David about this shipwreck in my research on it. The other ways that I've been able to research it is, I mentioned the Lloyd's of London have recently digitised a large number of their survey reports, and you can find them. Now, it's not a complete series, but I could find most of the annual survey reports for Queen of Nations from 1861 when it was launched until 1881 when it was wrecked. And that just gives you an idea of how it was built which is useful for maritime archaeologists, but also how it was rated. In other words, how robust it was and the quality of the vessel. And also I could start to see Samuel Bach's signature appearing on the final certificates of that as well. Certainly I use Trove for historical newspaper accounts, but I'm always a bit wary of them, to be honest. You know, I don't believe everything I read in the newspapers. So one of the things I did do was I went out to what was then State Archives and Records New South Wales. It's now rebranded as Museums of History New South Wales. And I actually brought up the rough minute books of the Marine Board of New South Wales. And you saw some of the scribbled writing there. They were very rough minutes and took a fair bit of deciphering or paleography on the handwriting. But I was pleased to see that the proceedings of the board were actually very accurately represented in the newspapers of the day. So it was good to actually triangulate that a little bit and see that the papers got it right in this case. And of course, the papers also were the ones who were on shore interviewing the crew as they came up on the beach. And they were the ones who really broke the story about the captain being drunk. Whereas, you know, if you had just gone through the official inquiry, then you'd be left to, it's basically the word of the captain against the word of the crew. And you know, theoretically, you should be trusting the captain as the officer. I also managed to find a few other bits and pieces. So the State Library of Victoria and State Library of Queensland both have records of some of the immigrant voyages of Queen of Nations too. So they just gave me a bit of a sense of the spaces on board the ship and its previous trade as an immigrant vessel before both the transition to steam, but also the winding up of the Emigration Commission in England in 1878, which reduced the number of people who had paid or subsidised shipment to the Australasian colonies. So they're probably the main sources that I used, as well as actually walking a few steps down and talking to the maritime archaeologists in my museum as well and asking them what they knew about it. So one of them, for instance, Kieran, had dived on the wreck and he actually said, look, it's a really shallow wreck. It's hard to dive on because at 4 or 5 meters depth, you've got waves smashing over you and pushing you around all the time, which is probably one of the reasons why the vessel hasn't been looted. But I've also been gently leaning on the archaeologists to say, hey, it's a very intact 19th century cargo. Are you interested in maybe putting in an excavation permit to go and work with the local community to see what else we could find on Queen of Nations?
Which does lead into one question, and I am going to have to wrap us up, but this is a very quick one, I think, Peter. Somebody asking, are people able to dive in and around the shipwreck sites, or are they closed off to the public somehow?
No, certainly most historic shipwrecks, with a few exceptions, most historic shipwrecks you can dive on and around, just don't take anything. I mentioned the Historic Shipwrecks Act 1976. That's been superseded by the Underwater Cultural Heritage Act 2018, which basically protects all shipwrecks and also submerged aircraft that are more than 75 years old. So if it's a recent shipwreck, it's unlikely to be protected under that law. But very broadly, if you do try to take things off shipwrecks, you can be prosecuted. And so we prefer you don't do that. Leave things there. If you want to dive and excavate them, you need to be a trained maritime archaeologist and put in a permit under the relevant state or Commonwealth body. But you certainly are able to dive on them for recreation. And that's really the main reason we say don't pull it apart, so that it's still there for other people as well. Indeed. On the other hand, if artifacts like the brandy bottle wash ashore, that's a little trickier. It's not that you've removed it from a shipwreck, but it's still associated with that wreck. And therefore, you really should take it to the local historical society, who in most cases will be the ones who have legal custody of it. So also, if you took something from a wreck years and years ago, you may want to just quietly deliver it to them as well and ask them to be the ongoing custodians.
Very diplomatic answer. Thank you. Now, I am going to have to stop it there. We are, in fact, just about out of time. There are a couple of questions here we haven't been able to answer, but I think that Katie will be able to capture those. And if we send them through to our speakers, they may well be able to answer those, and we can then post that and add it to the recording. So can I just repeat my thanks to our two fabulous speakers today, Dr. Luke Keogh and Dr. Peter Hobbins. I think you'll agree that we heard two really engrossing papers, very different, but really, really interesting. So thank you. I'd also like to thank the team behind Material Histories, Dr. Lorinda Kramer and her colleagues at Deakin University, Katie Dunning at the Old Treasury Building, who manages all the tech expertly, and our colleagues at the Australian Catholic University. And a special thanks also to you, our audience. Now, the next seminar in the Material History series will be held at the same time on Friday, the 13th of September. We're trying very hard not to be superstitious here. This seminar is entitled Objects of Time, and it features Professor Emeritus Graham Davison of Monash University and Dr. Matthew Champion of the University of Melbourne. And they will be talking about some of the obvious things, clocks, but also timekeeping in the early modern world. So I do hope you can join us for that. Remember that if you have a paper you'd like to present in this series, we do welcome submissions. So go to the Material Histories page on the Old Treasury Building website, and please don't be shy. We'd love to hear from you. And with that, I'll say thank you and good afternoon, everyone.